Tere päevast. Good afternoon. So I'm the last speaker, but hopefully you're still here and still attentive. And I will be talking about how the changing world order influences aspiring global faiths. When we talk about religion, some have talked about globalization. How does that influence religion? I'm actually not in the theology department, and so I'm coming from international relations. And we oftentimes leave religion and faith aside, focusing on power and economics. But there's a lot more to the changing world order than just power or economics. And so specifically when we look at religions, we have to remember that in relations of hierarchy, we also have cultural exchanges involved as well. And so it's not just about power and coercion in terms of economics and politics, but culture is there as well. If we look at a history of global religion, we can look at Christianity here in Estonia as well as Islam. And oftentimes religions have spread on the backs of imperialism and political hegemony. In a lot of ways, I like to think of this as cultural upload. Today, we don't see as many crusades in that way, but we do have cultural imperialism, and we do have certainly hierarchies in cultural exchanges. So what will happen in the future as we see the world is changing? What does a changing world order really mean? There's certainly a lot behind that term, and different authors will argue different things, but there are a few themes that everybody can agree on. First of all, the United States is not going to have the influence that it has if we look at the post-World War II order since 1945. It will be a post-American world order. Now, is that because of a lack of legitimacy, a void in US leadership? To a certain extent, I believe so. Also, we're seeing a rise of the rest. So we're looking at India, China in particular, and non-Western states increase in their influence, and that also has an impact on culture and cultural exchanges. Specifically, when we're looking here is what I dub a cultural upload. So to what extent can one culture upload or give, export their culture to a receiving region? What we're also going to see is much more diversity in the world, the diversity of ideas, diversity of ideologies, diversity of rules, coming from different regions. This will be competing, coexisting ideas, and so we're going to have a world that is not as unified as perhaps the liberal world order that we've seen. Acharya dubs this a world of, or regional worlds, where it's not a single world, it's a planet, a system of sub-regional worlds. So what does this mean for global religions? Specifically, today I'd like to mention two, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, what would a day about superstition and faith be without talking about Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses? I know in Estonia, the least religious country in Europe, certainly I thought we've got to bring in the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses. So, when taking these churches, what we can do is we can narrow in, zoom in, like all case studies, to look at how this process plays out. Now, these examples are extreme variables. These are US, American-centric churches that are not as global, if we look at Catholicism or some others, but have global aspirations. And we've all heard the knock on our doors, right? These are the proselyting, evangelizing faiths. So what happens to American-centric churches in a world that is no more dominated by American culture? When we look at the history of these two churches, they've been rather successful. Both of them are medium-sized churches, around 8 million members, which is pretty significant. The Mormons claim higher membership, but in reality, I would say it's a similar rate in terms of active, practicing members. When we look at the success of both of these countries, you can draw a very clear link to the hegemonic position of the United States and their actual success. For example, Madeleine Albright had mentioned that she told many ministers of foreign affairs to accept Mormon missionaries, that they would carry the good news of the gospel as well as democratizing American values and principles. So she openly said and saw these are agents of American cultural export. If we look at some of the foundational conceptual aspects of both churches, in a lot of ways you could look at Mormonism as an attempt to Americanize Christianity. Both religions founded in the 1800s in the United States. Mormonism really piggybacking on the concepts of U.S. exceptionalism. Jehovah's Witnesses focusing on the role of religion and the separation of religion and state. America was largely founded, at least in some of the northeastern colonies, maybe not the southern colonies, on the idea of freedom of religion, right? Being able to practice a religion that was not the state-sanctioned religion. And so some of the practices in Jehovah's Witnesses are still piggybacking on this idea. And so that's why some of the more controversial aspects of not voting, not serving in the military, not saluting or participating in a Pledge of Allegiance, because their allegiance is only to the kingdom of God, not to a state, which can seem somewhat foreign to us in a secular Estonia. But when we take into consideration the foundation of the United States, that concept, while not standard and the majority in the United States, is certainly American in nature. So what happens? And when we look at the current affairs in Russia, we can see exactly the developments, where American-based, or as they would say, non-traditional religions are having a much more difficult time with their cultural export. First of all, we should note with Mormonism, they rely on foreign missionaries primarily. Jehovah's Witnesses more so on local missionaries to evangelize. In 2016, there was a Yaratova Act which banned standard missionary or evangelizing practices outside of an official institution of faith. This, in essence, completely undercuts the model of both of these religions, the growth models of both religions. In addition, in 2017, the Jehovah's Witnesses were banned as an organization. They were dubbed an extremist organization. Now, the legislation was originally earmarked to fight against extremist organizations, and both of these religions have taken a hit in part because of it. Some have speculated, specifically to the Jehovah's Witnesses, that it is precisely these aspects of not participation in the military, not participation in voting, where that was deemed as too radical. There was not an opportunity for members of the Jehovah's Witness faith to buy into the legitimacy of the regime. Mormonism, on the other hand, was not banned. In some ways, they did not have nearly the size of members in Russia as the Jehovah's Witnesses, so maybe they were not seen as a big deal, something to worry about. But also there's an avenue for them to still be very patriotic, serve in the military, vote. I imagine you would find many Putin supporters within Mormon circles in Russia. But they still rely on the foreign missionaries, and oftentimes there are rumors about connections between Mormon missionaries and CIA agents, and the foreign aspect is definitely something that resonates in a negative way in Russia. On the other hand, when we see this pushback or a rise in obstacles for foreign religions, right, the cultural upload is not as effective, we also see a rise in natural religions. And here we have to remember that religions are vehicles of cultural exchange and the forces that give cultures from one generation to the next. So I'm not looking at too much theology, but simply the cultural vehicles in this aspect. The Orthodox Church, on the other hand, has been has benefited in this sense from the changing world order. and it is seen increase in legitimacy, a rise with rising nationalism. And in a lot of ways, it's a theological and cultural force for the Ruski mir, right? This new Russian world. In essence, we have a partnership between government officials and church leaders who see this as an opportunity to create regime legitimacy, as well as creating a stable foundation for what they deem as an Orthodox civilization. We see this especially since 2012, where Putin has been able to use conservative Orthodox rhetoric to justify a confrontational standoff with the West. We've seen this especially in terms of LGBT policies, where they're branded as foreign, as Western, and that aligns also with this idea of an Orthodox civilization. So, what is the future then for global religions? Specifically for US-based global religions, the time of piggybacking on US hegemony is over. That means that it's time to go local or go home. And I think in a lot of ways there are two ways in which they could be thinking about this. First of all, to decentralize their organizational structures. Both of the churches mentioned today have hierarchical structures, and decentralizing, giving more role to the peripheries, will certainly be a good start. So the core should be involved in coordinating, not commanding. And the other is to embrace the local, to make sure that the concepts that are evident and dominating in local culture are the ones that are being promoted within the church overall. So with that, we'll have to see what happens, but in the era of global change, a changing world order, global religions will certainly have to change with it. Thank you.